we began our study of Seder Nashim, the third of the six Sidarim in the Mishnah. And though Nashim means women, as I have explained, these tractates deal with personal law, marriage, divorce. Oh, Bob is here. Great. And so forth. And as I have mentioned repeatedly, the order of the tractates has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with how many chapters are in the particular tractate. And it so happens that the tractate of Nashim, which has the most chapters, is Yevamot. And Yevamot refers to the levirate marriage, the brother-in-law of a widow who has had no children. The Torah says sons, but the rabbis expand that to children. The brother-in-law, that is the deceased brother, has the obligation of marrying the widow, and the first son born would be considered the son of the deceased brother. And as I explained last time, this is really comes from the time, the biblical time, when the land was divided up among the tribes. So it was very important that the land continue in the descendants of that tribe. So if the widow were to marry someone from another tribe, then that would kind of mess things up. But this law continues, and even though I would argue the original reason for it is no longer applicable, but the practice of yibum, which is the noun yud beit mem, yibum, continues, and we have this whole tractate dealing with it. It's known as, if not the most difficult, one of the most difficult tractates in the Mishnah.
Can I ask a quick
Yes.
question? So the inheritance thing, is that just land, or is it also any inheritance?
No, it's mainly land, which was the obviously it still is the most significant property to be handed on to the next generation.
And so if someone dies without children, so their next of kin for inheritance is probably the brother.
Yeah, it gets complicated, and we will be dealing with some of that, at least as far as the Mishnah is concerned. Yes, there are within the halacha, these issues are dealt with, and we will look upon it. Yes, Nelson.
If I remember my book of Ruth correctly, don't you also inherit the debts? You have to pay the debts of the father.
Well, yeah, you inherit everything. In other words, the positive and the negative. That is not canceled with death. But anyhow, last week somebody, I think it was Elliot, raised the issue of pilegesh, because as we saw in the first Mishnah, there is a reference to rival wives. In Hebrew, tsarot. Tsara or tsarot are other wives. Obviously, as you know, the Bible has many, at least in patriarchal times, more than one wife. I talked about this last time, that the Takana of Rabbeinu Gershom in Me'or HaGolah, he's known as. He was a German, and this Takana, which he issued about the year 1000, that Jews can only have one wife. This Takana was not observed in Sephardic and other communities, and I told the story of visiting a Yemenite family with two wives when I was first in Israel, and in the 50s, and the Yemenite immigration was at its height, and Israel allowed those marriages to continue, but did not allow that practice to continue. But couples who were already married and lived that way were continuing to live that way in Israel. So I think it was Elliot who asked the question about Pilegesh. We know, of course, from Genesis of Abraham and Hagar, Rachel and Leah both had Pilagshim. They had Amot. They had servants who then slept with Jacob, and their children, their sons, were also counted among the tribes of Israel. And so the question is, what about Pilagshim in Halacha? And I did a little research and found that really in the Talmud, there's no reference to Pilagshim. But if we go in post-biblical times, we do have Ramban with a nun, Nachmanides, lived about the same time as Rambam. Maimonides, Ides in Ides in Greek is son. So Nachmanides, son of Nachman, Moshe ben Nachman. Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon. So Nachmanides has the opinion, expresses the opinion that it is permitted to have Pilagshim, but his opinion was rejected. That is the common, the most prominent position throughout history. However, there are a couple examples that, for instance, Harav Eliyahu of Avrajal allowed a man to marry a woman in the case that she was an aguna. She was her husband had never given her a get. There's no proof that he died, and she is an anchored woman. She cannot officially marry another man, if the man had not yet had children, this rabbi allowed it's not really a marriage, but a relationship, a sexual relationship with a woman outside of marriage. Also, there's an example of a Rabbi Raphael Birdugu. These are Sephardic. Allowed a man to take a pilegesh, a Jewish pilegesh, in a case that, according to the text in Wikipedia, lest he assimilate. A strange statement. In 2006, interestingly enough, a contemporary scholar by the name of Tzvi Zohar wrote an article in which he suggested that pilagshut be allowed so that religious couples who want to live together but don't want to get married can do that. He mentions in this article examples of couples who want very much to live together, but they're not old enough, or they don't really feel able to take on the responsibilities of marriage. And Zohar looks through the halachic sources and finds sources that would allow this. However, at least 3 articles were published after that rejecting his arguments, and it seems that that really went nowhere. The Wikipedia article, which I read in Hebrew, concludes by saying that with the movement towards women's equality and women gaining knowledge and employment and so forth, the interest in such a thing has gone way down, and it's no longer really acceptable. Elliot, you had a question.
Yes, Rabbi, what's apparent to me is it seems that in biblical times, marriage was designed to ensure the continuity of funds from one generation to another, and also to procreate. The idea of getting married out of love or romance doesn't seem to exist there. I gather it doesn't work so much today either, given the rate of divorce.
Yes, you are correct. As in most traditional societies today, even among Indians and other societies, the typical marriage is done with some kind of an agreement between the parents of the groom and the parents of the bride. They are arranged. No dating or anything like that. That's a phenomenon of Europe, and Jews took it on, of course, but not among the those ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, who still insist on the old way of putting couples together. Yes, Nelson.
I guess I see it differently. The number one reason people cite for divorce is they're no longer in love. It seems to me they're expecting something that they're not getting. So that love is still expected. I've seen articles by Indians saying that it's expected that a couple will fall in love. And recently I saw a movie about the making of Fiddler on the Roof, which featured a long women's lib discussion of the song "Do You Love Me?" So I think it's really important to people. They just don't know how to find it. They don't know how to sustain it.
Yes, absolutely. Uh, anyhow, Elliot, you're right that romantic concerns and so forth were not typical in the Jewish tradition, as they weren't in any other tradition up until um, the European kind of movement that we live, we who are not ultra orthodox still live with, this expectation that you find you're the one person in the world with whom you want to spend the rest of your life. Um, before we go back to the text, I wanted to mention something else that I noticed today. Some of you may have seen it. There is a new edition of the Mishnah, which has just been published in August. It is a 3-volume edition, and it is published by the Oxford University Press. It is annotated and is done by, I believe it's 51 scholars who have contributed to this, but it costs $645. I guess there's hope that somehow they'll publish it in a way that other people that maybe some people will buy it. I suppose some libraries have already bought it and will continue, but it's an interesting effort. I just wanted to quote a couple things from the article. One of the editors, Shai Cohn, is quoted as saying, "My ideal audience would be a professor of New Testament. I kept on thinking about academics who are very bright, very learned, and have worked on related questions, for whom the Mishnah is fundamentally a closed text because there's nothing out there." So then he says, the Mishnah is a closed text, he explained. If you ever looked at the Mishnah, you will know instantly how hard and difficult it is, he said. The language I like to use is lapidary. It needs you to come in there with a chisel and start banging on it. And then you can sort of shape it into something that you can understand. But if you just pick it up and start to read it, you have no idea what it's talking about. I thought that was a very well put statement. I don't expect to buy this, though I would love to have it. But I'm not going to spend $600 on a book or 3 books. Okay, so last time we looked at the various sources in the Torah. First one being in Deuteronomy, where we learn about this practice of yibum. The second source that we looked at was in Vayikra, the laws of forbidden sexual relationships, erva. And both of these are obviously assumed before anyone looks at the text. And I mentioned last time that it unusual in the Sefaria edition of the Mishnah, before the Mishnah itself begins, there is a long paragraph explaining what you need to know in order to begin to read the Mishnah. We've mentioned this before. I mentioned it when we first started studying with brachot, me'ematai korin et shema ba'aravim. The Mishnah assumes you know what the Shema is, and you know you're required to say it when you lie down and when you rise up. And so it starts off by asking, what time do you do it? It's not a logical presentation. The Mishnah is not meant to do that. In contrast, if you open up a Mishneh Torah, the Rambam's code of Jewish law, you will see a very different approach, because he starts by laying out everything in a logical way. So he'll start by pointing out the commandments in the Torah on which the text that he is going to go on to develop is based. And then he lays it out in a logical way that you can understand what's involved. That's not the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is obviously not meant as a code. It's not meant like the Mishneh Torah is. Rambam wrote the Mishneh Torah in Hebrew, the only thing he wrote in Hebrew. Even his commentary to the Mishnah, he wrote in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew letters, but Arabic. And he explains in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah that his purpose was that every Jew with his Mishneh Torah and the Torah shebichtav, the Torah text itself, with those two texts, you know what you need to know. And then you can use the time that you will save from going through the Talmud and trying to figure things out to study physics. That is, to learn about the world, to study philosophy, so that your way of thinking will be appropriate, correct, and you won't be led astray by many things in the Bible that should not be read literally. Like, for instance, that God has a hand or fingers or an arm, or that God gets angry, or all kinds of other things that read on the surface literally will lead you astray. The Mishnah, in contrast, is meant as a text to be studied by people who don't need the introduction. They know what Yibum is. They know what the laws of incest are. And therefore, the Mishnah in Yevamot, chapter 1, verse 1, can already tell us that there are 15 categories of women whose familial relationships are forbidden as incestuous. And consequently, these women exempt their rival wives and the rival wives of their rival wives, both from chalitza and from levirate marriage forever. That is, they also exempt rival wives of rival wives of rival wives, etc. Ad sof ha'olam, forever and ever. Chalitza is the alternative to yibum. If the brother-in-law does not want to marry his widowed sister-in-law, then the ceremony of chalitza is done. We read about it already in Devarim, in Deuteronomy. It says that in verse 7, Im lo yachpotz ha'ish, if the brother-in-law doesn't want to marry his widowed sister-in-law, then she should go to the gate, meaning to come before the court, to the elders, to the judges, and she should then say, Me'ein yivami lahakim la'achiv shem b'Yisrael. My husband's brother refuses to establish a name in Israel for his brother. He refuses lo avayabmi. He will not perform the duty of a brother-in-law, of a levir, levirate marriage. Latin. The elders of the city then should speak to that man, and he should say to them officially in the court, Lo chapatzti lekachta. I don't want to marry her. Lakach here is not just simply to take, but to marry. I don't want to marry her. Then she, the widow, should come to him in front of the judges, take off. Here is the word chalitza. The correct way of saying to take off your shoes, even in modern Hebrew, is lachlotz et hana'al. I don't know how many Israelis still use that, Steve. Do people still say that?
It could be.
But you don't.
Yeah, well, my Hebrew is mostly from work, and people at work don't take their shoes off.
Oh, okay. Anyhow, I think I don't think I ever told you the story about my Hebrew. I once met someone I know who came from Israel, and she was visiting her father and introduces me to her father, and we're chatting a little bit, and he says, "Where did you learn your Hebrew? You sound like a prophet. you speak Hebrew like a prophet." I said, I learned, I don't speak street Hebrew. I don't live here, and so the Hebrew that I speak was what I learned from texts and so forth. He says, so he tells me this story. One day he's on a bus, and he's sitting next to a man, and the man speaks a beautiful Hebrew, and he turns to him and he says, "My God, where did you learn your Hebrew?" So the man says, I am a writer. and he gives him on the bus ride, gives him one of his books to read. So that was a compliment. Sometimes I wonder if it's a compliment when people say you sound like you came out of the time of the prophets. Languages develop and change, just like everything else human. And
Rabbi, when I was in Israel, I tried my tzibrecha in the Yiddish. I'd go to somebody who I thought maybe have understood Yiddish, and I'd ask them where to find a certain bus and so forth. And fortunately, that worked.
well, that's good. That's good. Uh, but anyhow, chaltza is take off the chalitza, take off his sandal, and she should then spit, pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and then make the following declaration. Kacha ye'aseh la'ish asher lo yivneh et beit achiv. So it should be done to a man who does not take up the duty of rebuilding the house of his deceased brother. In other words, providing an heir to his brother's estate. And this person's name should be spread in Israel. He should have a nickname, Beit Chalutz Hana'al, the family of the unsaddled one. Yes, Nelson.
If this is really about preserving land inside the tribe, I assume that the brother who won't take up the marriage inherits it anyway, and so it stays inside the same family.
Yes, but not in the same big family, right? But that man has no one to inherit that particular piece of property from as his particular heir. So yes, it stays in the general family. It doesn't leave the tribe. But the point is they wanted to have that man have an heir with his name, to continue that line. I want to point out something interesting that is that shows something very interesting and very important. If you look at the text of the first Mishnah, it says that 15 categories of women constitute familial relationships that are forbidden as incestuous, and they exempt their wives from chalitza and levirate marriage forever. Notice the order. The order is not levirate marriage and then chalitza, but rather chalitza comes first, yibum is second. The Mishnah in Bechorot, oops, too far. The Mishnah in Bechorot, here we are. It's an interesting Mishnah that talks about firstborn animals. And it continues to say that the mitzvah of levirate marriage, yibum, takes precedence over the mitzvah of chalitza. Wait just a minute. The mitzvah of designating, okay, here we are. The mitzvah of levirate marriage, yibum, takes precedence over the mitzvah of chalitza, as it says, and if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife. But the Mishnah adds, this was the case initially when people would intend that their performance of Yibum was for the sake of the mitzvah. But now that they do not intend that their performance of levirate marriage be for the sake of mitzvah, but rather for reasons such as the beauty of the sister-in-law, or that the brother-in-law will have some financial gain, the rabbis reversed it and said, no, chalitza takes precedence over yibum. So already in the Mishnah, in contrast to the biblical text, where chalitza is considered a disgrace, the text is clear that the yibum should be done, and the man who refuses is to be denigrated and have a name attached to him, and she spits in his face. The rabbis already turn it around and say, no, we want to do with chalitza is primary, yibum is secondary. Okay, coming back to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah is saying that if one of the wives is not permitted to do the yibum or chalitza with the brother-in-law, because the brother-in-law has some kind of a relationship with her that would make the marriage incestuous. In other words, say the brother-in-law married the widow's sister, or the widow's another relative of the widow that is too close. So, for instance, we go through here in the Mishnah what these are, what constitutes an incestuous relationship. The Mishnah is saying in a case of plural marriage, if one of the wives cannot marry the brother-in-law, then none of the wives can marry the brother-in-law, and we don't do yibum and we don't do chalitza. They're both canceled out. Potrot. They are peturim. They are no longer required. They're free from the obligation of both yibum and chalitza. And then the Mishnah goes through and lists the various categories of incestuous relationships. So, if the deceased husband had married the daughter of his brother, she would be, this is one of the forbidden ones, Bito, the deceased daughter from a previous marriage. When he died childless, his brother's own daughter came before her father for levirate marriage. Therefore, she is exempt. and all of the rival wives, all of the other wives also are exempt. Bat bito, the same applies if the deceased brother's widow is the daughter of the daughter, in other words, the granddaughter of her brother-in-law. It's a little far-fetched as far as I'm concerned when we're talking about age differences, but apparently those kinds of things happened with, particularly, I guess, with plural marriages. Or if she is the daughter of his son, or the daughter of his wife. And similarly, if the woman, the widow, is the daughter of the son of the wife of her brother-in-law, or the daughter of his wife's daughter, or if she is the mother-in-law of her brother-in-law, who she would be marrying, or his mother-in-law's mother, or his father-in-law's mother. All of these exempt her and her rival wives, both from chalitza and leveret marriage. And then the Mishnah continues its list of close relatives. If the Yavama, that is the widow, is the maternal half-sister of her brother-in-law, or if she is the sister of his mother, or his wife's sister, then again, this exempts her. These would be incestuous relationships. Or if she was the wife of his maternal half-brother, and after this brother died or divorced his wife, she married another of his father's brothers, who was not her relative, and this brother died, she is exempt. In this case, the obligation to enter into leveret marriage should be incurred by the surviving brother. But since she was previously the wife of his maternal brother, she is exempt. The same applies to the wife of a brother with whom he did not coexist. Okay. In other words, they weren't alive at the same time. Okay, so anyhow, I'm gonna stop at this point just to indicate to you how crazily complex this is and why it's considered such a difficult tractate. Imagine all of these various relationships and it goes through this you kind of need a map here, and in fact I came across, there is such a book that someone has done, probably I assume for the Talmud, which will obviously expand upon this, a kind of a map that that helps you understand the relationships, so usually when we talk about this, we say, well, Shimon married Reuven's daughter. That's okay. However, if Reuven's daughter married somebody else, or another daughter married somebody else, and so forth and so on. So it becomes extremely complicated. I just want to finish this and then open it up to questions, and we'll see how deeply we want to go into this. With regard to all of these women listed as prohibited relationships, these halachot apply only if they were married to the deceased brother until the time of his death. However, this is not the case if they died during the deceased brother's lifetime, or if they refused their husbands when they were minors.
Wow.
This refusal is referring to the decree of the rabbis that a girl under the age of 12, whose father is no longer alive, may be married off by her brother or her brothers or her mother. However, such a marriage, she's a minor, can be terminated by her in an act called refusal, may aim, by declaring while still a minor that she doesn't want to be married to this guy. In this case, the marriage is annulled retroactively, and she's considered as though she were never married at all. If these women were divorced by their husband, the deceased brother, okay, or were found to be sexually underdeveloped women. This is a category we haven't seen before. Ilonit. Ilonit, plural iloniot, are women whose sexual characteristics have not fully developed, and she cannot really have sex and have children. This is considered a mistaken marriage and is null and void. In all such cases, rival wives are permitted. That is, there is no obligation for either yibum or chalitza. As the exemption for rival wives of forbidden relatives applies only when the forbidden relative was the brother's wife at the time of his death. That's when the levirate marriage, the yibum laws, come into effect. And the Mishnah comments that the language of this principle is imprecise, as you cannot say with regard to his mother-in-law and with regard to his mother-in-law's mother and with regard to his father-in-law's mother that they were found to be ilonit, as an ilonit is sterile. So how could that become a mother or a mother-in-law? Nor is the Mishnah precise when it says or refuse, as a refusal applies only to minors who couldn't give birth anyhow. So here it says okay, בכולן, אם מתו או מענו או נתגרשו או שנמצאו, צרותיהם מותרות. I ata yochol. Here, this very strange. I've never seen this before. That the Mishnah, in a certain sense, is correcting itself. You really can't say this about some of these cases because they have children. So how could you say that they are Ailaniot or that they were minors and canceled the marriage? Okay. This is the first Mishnah. Its message, from the way I look at it, its message is really that it is limiting the obligation of yibum or chalitza. It is limiting it to a small a population as possible. One woman is, because of relationships, cannot have a sexual relationship with her brother-in-law. That frees all of them. They may not have a problem at all, but there's no need to either do yibum or chalitza with any of the rival wives. I would argue that's the intent of this Mishnah. It goes into all of these relationships and everything else. But I think the main principle that it is making is to exempt the rival wives ad sof ha'olam, to limit this practice. Okay, questions?
Yeah, Rabbi, I think it's apparent that this is amazingly complex. I wonder if maybe one time there's some sort of visualization where we could see these different biological connections and who can't marry whom and so forth. Also, I wonder about the amount of interpersonal conflict and unhappiness that comes about as a result if someone is rejected or spat upon and so forth. Wow. Any further comments about that?
It must have, it must have been, if it was ever done, it must have been a rather major event in the town or wherever it was that they lived. I'll see if I can't get a hold of this book that I think they have it at the Ohio State University Library, and I'm going to see if I can't prevail upon my wife to figure out a way for me to get a hold of it. Yes, Nelson.
In arranging a marriage, did parents plan to avoid this or to make sure it happened, or is it really that much on their conscious?
The arranged marriage up and through today, in fact, is obviously they do research on the other person's, on the bride's family researches the groom's family researches the bride's family before there's any kind of an agreement, probably even before they meet for the first time. It was, I believe, I know that my maternal grandparents were cousins. And I've heard of other marriages of Eastern European Jews where the husband and wife were related. Not, I know, for instance, that one of my great uncles was married to his niece. So that I think that was probably quite widespread in earlier times in some communities. Questions, other questions?
Rabbi, it appears that personality compatibility was not a consideration at this point in time. And if people met the biological and financial requirements to get married, they would go ahead. But personal compatibility, differences in temperament and so forth, which could in the end make a big difference, were not part of this research that was done.
That's correct. But as you know from certain movies and so forth, the couple do meet. They meet in public because they're not allowed to be in a room by themselves. So I think I've mentioned this, that hotel lobbies are used by these couples for a meeting, that they get to know each other, that they get a chance to spend some time together. And oftentimes they meet a couple times before it's decided that they will marry. So there is some attempt to, but as you know from some of the movies and series on TV, this becomes complicated. Sometimes the parents want this, and the young couple wants this, and it causes tension and problems. But it was a different world, and of course, in today in ultra Orthodox communities, it's still that world. They continue this practice, and the results. The results are not always positive. I keep thinking back to many years ago, Rabbi Abraham Twersky, who is he was now passed, but he was a giant in the field of addiction treatment. He was a chassid from a very prominent Hasidic family, but he was also a psychiatrist, and he became an expert in the treatment of addiction. And one year, many years ago, he came to Cleveland and gave a public lecture, and that was on a Sunday night. And on Monday morning, he had asked all the rabbis to come together. He had something to share with the rabbis. And what his lecture was about was spousal abuse between husbands and wives. And at that meeting, he brought his daughter who lived in Jerusalem and who was married to a member of a very prominent Hasidic family in Jerusalem. And the daughter had, I think, 4 children, and her husband was abusive, apparently physically abusive. And her parents, her family was here, and she was in Jerusalem, and she felt she couldn't go to her husband's family. And on a vacation that she took with her children to visit her family here, she never went back. And she was there, and she told us about what happened. And Rabbi Twersky said that every time he went to the state of Israel, he learned about another case in the ultra-Orthodox community of abuse. So they keep it quiet. The reason he wanted to meet with rabbis, he told us, was if a couple comes, or a member of the couple comes and talks to you about problems in the marriage, he says, when I was in medical school, my teachers didn't teach me how to detect addiction. I had to learn that on my own. People don't come to the doctor and say, "Doctor, I'm addicted." They come to the doctor with some other problem. The doctor has to probe. If a couple or a member of a couple comes to you with problems in the marriage, you have to probe. You are most likely the first person outside of the family that person has approached. You need to probe to find out if there's abuse. I've never forgotten that meeting. It was a very moving. So anyhow, the arranged marriage does not solve. In fact, I think it just doesn't solve that problem.
Rabbi, I have a question on terminology, pretty basic one. My initial understanding was there's the Mishnah and the Gemara, the two of which are referred to as the Talmud. But
Correct.
I've heard other people say the Mishnah and the Talmud, referring to what I thought was the Gemara. Is the term Gemara and Talmud, are they interchangeable? Because I thought it was the two parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara, that would give you the Talmud. Could you clarify?
You're correct that the Mishnah and the Gemara represent the Talmud, but oftentimes people refer to the Gemara as Talmud. But you can't have Talmud without Mishnah, right? There is no commentary without the text. Just like
Rabbi
you can't have Rashi without the Chumash, right?
Right. Did Rabbi Steinsaltz make commentaries on both the Torah and then the Talmud as well?
His commentary, I don't know that he has a commentary on the Torah, but he has a commentary on the Talmud.
I think it took him 40 years to produce all that he produced.
It was an amazing accomplishment, and he was an amazing man. I was privileged to hear him a couple times in Jerusalem, and he was, I remember when he was in the process of producing the Talmud, and he expressed the hope that he would finish it. And at the time I said, he should live to 120, but I don't see him finishing it. And sure enough, he did. Obviously, he had a lot of help, but it's an amazing achievement, and his knowledge was really extraordinary. Not only
I wonder to what degree this new edition you referred to would be in accord with Rabbi Steinsaltz's comments.
This Mishnah edition is done by scholars both here and in Israel, I think, not sure, but I know here, who are working only with the Mishnah. I'm not sure how much they refer to the Talmud. Part of the contribution of Steinsaltz's edition is that he does have occasional comments about words and origin of words and of realia. That is, he explains how things happen. Like, for instance, I was studying just Tuesday, and with a friend, we were studying Baba Kama, and it talks there about a fire and somebody who causes a fire in somebody else's property and what the liability is. And there's a reference to the fire burning stones, which doesn't sound like it makes any sense. But Steinsaltz had a comment in the margin that there are a certain kind of, say, limestone that can be burned.
Wow.
And he explained in that comment the chemical reactions. I don't know whether he studied chemistry or he just consulted with somebody in chemistry.
Rabbi, I noticed my friend Steve Creed from Toronto joined. He had a little trouble
Yes.
getting in earlier, but he's with us.
I see, and I welcome him. How are you, Steve?
I'm fine, Rabbi. Yes, they changed the Zoom number, the shul
Yeah.
office, and that's the old one didn't work. And I tried for 15 minutes, finally phoned Elliot.
I'm sorry.
My follow-up question to what Elliot was asking about what is in the Talmud. So I was been taught by Rabbi Hecht in Toronto that the Talmud is everything, including what we've been discussing today. I think that's right, and that it would include all the other commentaries, like the codes, like the guide to the perplexed, etc. Is that true or not?
No. You may be referring to Torah. The Torah, we can talk about Torah teaching as all inclusive, but Talmud. We speak of Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. Torah, in that sense, can be understood to include everything. Codes, commentaries, legends, the whole thing, the whole shebang. But I think that would be more Torah teaching. Torah means teaching. Talmud, of course, also means teaching. But we can refer to Torah as all inclusive, or it can mean the 5 books of Moses, or we can talk about Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, which would refer to the Mishnah and the Midrash and the Talmud and everything following.
So, Rabbi, those people who say that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he received the entire Torah, were they talking about some inclinations for the Mishnah, the Gemara, and all the commentaries, that somehow they were divinely implanted in Moshe, who somehow transmitted them on downward?
Indeed, I have referred to the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. It does not say HaTorah. It says Torah. And the Pharisees believed that Moses received not only the written Torah, HaTorah, but also the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. And he passed it on to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly, and the men of the great assembly to the pairs, and the pairs to the rabbis. And so, yes, the Pharisaic understanding is that indeed Moses did receive the oral teachings on Sinai, and they were passed on orally all the way to us.
That's phenomenal, considering it was quite a few years prior to the printing press.
Rabbi, can I ask
Yes,
again?
but you see what this does, and this is terribly important to understand. In the time of the Talmud, in the time of the Gemara, both in Babylonia and in the land of Israel, they made a big distinction between Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh. The written Torah, which was written down in the text. It was handwritten. They didn't have printing. And the oral Torah, which was not written down. And if you had a Mishnah, you weren't allowed to bring it into the house of study. You could only bring a written Torah in. You couldn't bring the Mishnah in. How did they study the Mishnah? They had someone, usually blind, who had memorized it.
Wow.
And he would stand up and recite it. And that's the way they had their discussions. There's a big difference between a written text and an oral text. A written text is more firm, is less subject to change. Oral teachings, as you know from the game we used to play, when you whisper something in somebody's ear and they pass it on to somebody and they pass it on and they pass it on.
Totally
Telephone.
changed.
20 people later, the person says what he heard. And then the
Different.
person who started it says what he said. And you see that it changed radically, usually. What this did was it allowed for the tradition to develop. Can you imagine if we didn't have the oral teaching, we would not exist because the temple was destroyed and there are no sacrifices. Most peoples whose land was taken over, assimilated and disappeared. We did not. Part of the reason is this tradition of the oral teaching. It provided, yes, with a belief that it came from Moses, but also with an understanding that each generation has to interpret this for itself, and it's going to change. That's why I'm a conservative Jew. I'm not an Orthodox Jew. I'm a conservative Jew. I think that is the authentic Jewish position. The position is we are committed to the tradition, but we understand that the world is constantly changing. And if that tradition is going to have meaning for us, it too must change.
That's what you elegantly spoke to, Rabbi. Thanks again when you spoke to our Jewish think tank. And Steve is working on bringing in this Tristan Newman in August or September, this young kid who desires to become a conservative rabbi and is very passionate about it.
It'll be
Rabbi,
interesting to see.
I think I think Rabbi Lettofsky, Alan, you are aware that we also had the Rabbi Josh Foster, and he took a different approach. He discussed with us the future of conservative Judaism through the eyes of the youth, because he teaches that next generation. But I have another question. I'm still not quite clear on Torah. So I think what you're saying is that there's Torah and there's the Torah. The Torah then would be, to me, the written Torah, which is part of Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and the other part of the Torah is the oral tradition, which I'm still not 100% clear on what it includes. It's ongoing, and I understand your now somewhat more clearly your explanation of what conservative Judaism is. We conserve, but we also go with the times and the place. So, and the other Torah is Torah, not the Torah, the actual physical article. The Torah itself means everything. Is that correct?
I would argue that Torah Sheba'al Peh is a continuing process which continues to this day. And when you hear a sermon, I mean a sermon based on the Torah reading, not a sermon talking about Ukraine or abortion or the elections or something else, but a traditional sermon based on the Torah reading for that day. That too is oral Torah. That too is part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh.
Rabbi, what about these teshuvot that the modern day rabbis write?
Yes.
Is that part of it as well?
Yes, 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 absolutely. Absolutely, very much so. So that anything based on traditional texts and an attempt to make those texts relevant to life today, that is part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's what we're engaged in. That's what a Jew's supposed to do. A Jew is supposed to know as much as possible of that tradition and to live by it, which requires, in my opinion, not only a slavish, I mean, we don't have to dress like they did in the 16th century in Poland. That's not Judaism, in my view. Judaism is taking these texts and using them to understand the issues that we are dealing with today in our lives.
Rabbi, you remember Yaakov Lemmer, who you heard at the tribute to Cantor Schiffman the other day. He wears his kapata, and he has payas that look like springs, but yet I think he has a degree from Yeshiva University, so he is very Hasidic and yet knows about the modern world.
And he's the cantor at a non-Hasidic shul in New York.
Yes, and has a phenomenal voice.
He sure does. He sure does. That was a lovely concert, probably the best I think he's ever done.
Yes.
Anyhow, God bless you all. We're going to come back to Yevamot. I hope to get that visual thing and share it with you. But we're going to go on to go through the Mishnah Yevamot, and I'll try to make it as clear as possible. But I'm going to try and emphasize what I see as the crucial elements and not to get caught in the weeds. Anyhow, take good care.
Rabbi, can I just ask one more quick question?
Yes.
It's a universal thing. Actually, it was my wife's English birthday the other day, yesterday. And of course, we all suffer from the trauma of losing loved ones, what are the various ways of interpreting the expression, may their memory be for a blessing? Zichrona livracha, Zichrona livracha. Is it may they, in some respects, since we believe in Mechayim Mesim, may they bless us from Gan Eden?
No, I think
How is that
I
interpreted?
think the memory be a blessing really means that when we think of them, it should lead us, it should feel like a blessing. In other words, when we think of them, we should feel a kind of a sense of peace, of direction, a sense of remembering all of the good things they did and all of the things that they taught us that we should live by.
How about gratitude to Hashem for making them part of our lives?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think Judaism is a religion of action. We don't have great theological disputes. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. You know, you have the Hasidim, you have the Mishnah, you have this, fine. What counts is action. And the memory of our deceased should lead us on the right path, on the path of justice, of peace, on the path of respect for every human being and for the world which God created.
Okay.
God bless
Thank
you
you,
all.
Rabbi, for an excellent class.
One more comment. I
Yeah,
have one more comment because
Yeah, go
this has
ahead, please.
disturbed me my whole life, and I'm turning 80 in a couple days, Rabbi.
oh, Mazel Tov.
Thank you. And I need your comment about something because I look to you for guidance. You're one of my teachers, one of my great teachers. So what disturbs me is that there seems to be an attitude my whole life among the people under the umbrella of being Jews, the attitude that those at the top have an attitude and they think that they're at the top, the Haredi, the Hasidim, and they disparage all the way down. They look at a spectrum, I might be wrong, and that the spectrum is putting secular and reform at the bottom. And that how I evidence it is that I see that you aren't recognized even as a rabbi by those that claim that they have the authentic tradition of Judaism. You know that darn well. And this is what disturbs me greatly. They might not consider you or even a great Reform rabbi teacher as a rabbi in their Hasidic or whatever orthodoxy, but nonetheless, you are a rabbi, and I consider actually my conservative teachers and rabbis, many of them over the decades, as being as great or greater teachers in many cases than who they claim that we are the real rabbis, and your rabbis aren't even recognized by us as being rabbis. This is a great thing that disturbs me my whole life, and we have to have you for a lecture to clear this up.
I'll tell you one of my jokes and then we'll end. One of my favorite jokes is a woman is cooking a chicken soup and by mistake she goes in and gets this milchig spoon and she stirs the chicken soup with a milchig spoon and she calls the conservative rabbi and she says, "Rabbi, I have a question, I have a problem. I took by mistake a milchig spoon and I stirred my fleishik soup." What should I do? So the rabbi says to himself, well, let's see. A chicken soup with a fleishik spoon, that's okay. A milchik spoon in a milchik soup, that's okay. A milchik spoon in a fleishik soup, call the Orthodox rabbi. I am not an expert in kashrut. I could not tell you if the animal is glatt or not. I have never shechted a cow, and I don't plan to. I don't know those laws. I've never studied them. And to be honest with you, I'm not really interested in studying them. I do not have Orthodox smicha. I don't care that they don't recognize me as a rabbi. I think a rabbi, I believe, is at base a teacher. And as long as there are people who want to be my students, I consider them my students, and I try to be the best teacher I can. I don't paskin. If you have a traditional question, go to somebody who knows to give you the answer. That's not my expertise nor my interest. If you want to know if the chicken is kosher or whatever it is, don't ask me. I'm not interested. I couldn't tell you. That's not my area of expertise. They don't want to call me a rabbi. That's okay. I don't need their hechsher. All I need, if I have students who look to me as their teacher, that's all I need.
Rabbi, you certainly have accomplished that. And
Thank
it says
you.
in Pirkei Avot, find yourself a teacher. Well, we're thankful to Hashem we found you.
Well, I'm delighted. I'm delighted you feel that way. Take good care. See you next week. God bless you.